started. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Rose, and it's my privilege to serve Hunter College as its Dean for Diversity and Compliance. But this afternoon, it's my special privilege and great honor to be able to introduce to you Professor David Julian Hodges. You may have heard President Rabb describe outstanding faculty who have served our institution very well, inculcating a thirst for knowledge in their students, developing the right kinds of habits of mind and effort. Well, Professor Hodges has been one of those faculty members who has consistently, over the last 30 years, really served our institution well, served student cohort after student cohort very well. He has a very wide-ranging interest in different disciplinary areas. He's, in addition to being an anthropologist, he's had interest in civil rights, in prison reform, in the intersection of anthropology and education. And consistent with his wide-ranging research interests, he has served our institution in any number of capacities, not only in anthropology, which the chair of the Anthropology Department is here, very happy to acknowledge, but also in the School of Education, where he was a professor in the Educational Foundations Department, and at one time, acting dean of the School of Education. So David has really been a go-to person for our institution and has a number of remarkable insights on any number of issues. And it's sort of ironic that today we're going to be talking about civil rights because I guess David and I are gentlemen of a certain age, and we were talking the other day about the March on Washington and the events that sort of surrounded that March on Washington, and so that obviously was a very important point in the civil rights movement. And it's just ironic that we had that very discussion, it seems like, what, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, right? And today, we are now going to have the benefit of hearing the presentation on civil rights. So David, the program is all yours.
Well, I have to thank my colleague and friend, John Rose, for that gracious introduction. And I acknowledge my chair, the chair of the Anthropology Department, Dr. Ida Sussa, who graces me with her presence here. I welcome the opportunity to talk about the civil rights movement because it's something that I love to teach. Just one day after the anniversary of the assassination in Memphis, Tennessee of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., I think the assassination day, of course the birthday is a very important point for us to celebrate the life and the work and the legacy of Dr. King. But I think that the assassination day is something that I am very pleased to know that the news media continues to remember and to single out when we hear the news about Dr. King's assassination. He was there in Memphis on behalf of the striking sanitation workers. I think there are three remarkable events that surround that assassination. One is, I think, the greatest speech that he ever made. Of course, the I Have a Dream speech in Washington. You can't hear?
No, I said I was there.
Oh, you were at the I Have a Dream speech? Yes. Yeah. Well, were you there?
I was in high school.
Oh, okay. Well, that's... how many others were really involved with, what was your involvement?
I was a fifth.
Is anybody near the lines?
And got involved because there was a group that was teaching young people about civil rights. And I was part of the Pittsburgh contingency that marched from the train station. There's every time you see Martin Luther King, stop your back on the road. And we marched to the Lincoln Monument, and it was the first time in my life that I ever speaker and tell me I didn't have the right to fly the flag because we were each given one of the little American flags, and of course I'm so proud, I'm marching, and I'm in the Capitol, and I had a large white policeman who lunged at me and say, "Nigger, you don't have the right to wave that flag." And because I'm all green-eyed and, you know, wondering what's going on, I would never expect a policeman to say that to me. So I kept on with my little flag like this, and he lunged at me again, and there was a rather large, and I say large only because I'm 17 and I'm little, there was a large white man here that was part of the contingency. I remember him scooping me from the edge and taking my flag for my protection. So I have a very vivid memory of the March on Washington.
Was that coming out of Union Station in Washington?
Yes, we marched from Union Station, and that little girl getting off the train with me and my aunt, you know how they used to do the documentaries at the beginning of the year? And she jumped up in the theater when she saw me get off the train and said, "That's my niece, that's my niece." So I have, you know, vivid memories of the March on Washington.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I know that there are other experiences. In ordinary circumstances, I would want to go around the room and just ask all of you to, but I guess we just have an hour, so I don't want to do that this time. But I'm sure I will certainly leave some time for questions and answers, so that I'll get an opportunity to have some give and take. I think that you were saying that you were involved as well. You might give us a little.
I keep it quite brief. I was in junior high school. Actually, I should be a sophomore in high school. And I remember taking a bus down from New York City with a bunch of other kids and protesters. Now, of course, we didn't deal with the train station, so we went right to the wall, so no incidents. But I saw a bunch of guys from East Delaware all beat up. And I was scared of it. I was shocked to see it because I lived in Manhattan at the time. So nothing like that occurred, not to my knowledge. So I saw one that came up to, "Have you heard what's on Delaware?" I said, "No, I actually haven't." So I explained how brutal the beatings were.
Yeah.
So a real eye-opening.
Oh, yeah.
You can see them on media, but it's different when you talk to somebody in person.
Yeah. Well, those are the kinds of things that made the civil rights movement a very necessary movement. The kinds of things, the testimonies that you just heard were the kinds of things. And what was the civil rights movement all about? It was about race and the segregation that occurred and the discrimination that occurred and continues to occur. When you talked about the policeman and him using the N-word, that really was the climate of the time. And I often use the poem that was written by the great New York poet, County Cullen. It's called Incident, and it's a really powerful short poem. And it's about the use of that N-word. We have gotten to the point now where we just really don't use the N-word. We just always call it the N-word. But that's what the whole issue of race was what the civil rights movement was all about. And I'll just recite that poem. It's called Incident, and it's about a childhood visit from New York to Baltimore on the part of this poet laureate of New York, County Cullen. He wrote it during the Harlem Renaissance. He was a Harlem Renaissance poet. And it goes, "While riding in old Baltimore, head filled, heart filled with glee, I saw a Baltimorean keep looking straight at me. Well, I was only 8 years old, and he was no whit bigger. So I smiled, but he poked out his tongue and called me nigger. Well, I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until September. But of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember." Now, County Cullen captured in that short verse that could be used as a metaphor for the experience of being black in the United States. And that being black and being segregated and being discriminated against was what ultimately led to this that we refer to as the civil rights movement. I was referring to Dr. King earlier because this is the next day to the day that he was assassinated in Memphis. Dr. King uncharacteristically at that time referred to his own mortality. It was not characteristic of Dr. King to refer to himself often, but in the week preceding his assassination, he referred to himself several times. And in that mountaintop speech that was given the eve of his assassination, I just think it's so spiritually incredible that he almost predicted his assassination. I mean, he said, "I've been to the mountaintop, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land." And the previous Sunday in his church at Ebenezer, he co-pastored the church in Atlanta, Ebenezer Baptist Church, with his father, Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. And that previous Sunday, he gave this this speech that we could refer to as the drum major speech. You know, I think he said, and I'm paraphrasing, something to the order of, if you say anything about me after I've passed away, say that I was a drum major for justice. Don't say that I received a Nobel Peace Prize. Don't say that I was a PhD. Don't say any of these things that are trivial, but say that I was a drum major for justice. I was a drum major for righteousness. I was a drum major for peace. Now, that was somewhat controversial recently because of the King Memorial in Washington, D.C. Incidentally, if you haven't seen the King Memorial in Washington, D.C., I think it's really worth seeing. You just recently told me, just a few minutes ago, told me that you're doing one in Bergen County. I think that that's just the greatest kind of thing. But in the King Memorial, they took that quotation out of context, and they just put on the King Memorial, say I was a drum major for justice. Well, he did say that, but he prefaced it with all those disclaimers. He prefaced it with saying, don't say that I was a PhD. Don't say that I was received the Nobel Prize. If you say something about me, say that I was a drum major for justice. Well, all that wasn't on the monument. I think they removed it from the monument. I think there were several people who criticized it because that was not characteristic of Martin Luther King. Now, I mentioned Dr. King. I mentioned him because he was so crucial to the civil rights movement. He was by no means the only person or the towering figure of it, but he was certainly a very pivotal person in the civil rights movement. But I want, because I did know Dr. King personally, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and his father and my father were very close friends. They were both involved with the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in Atlanta. And they fought some mighty tough fights during the 40s and the 50s. And as a consequence, when I met Dr. King the first time, I was 13 years old, and the Atlanta branch of the NAACP had invited Dr. King to be the Emancipation Day speaker at a church, Big Bethel AME Church in Atlanta. And I was 13. Dr. King, I think, was 26 at the time. He had just come off the very successful Montgomery bus boycott, and he had just begun to write the book, Stride Toward Freedom, his first book. And his father and my father were just really so proud that Dr. King was going to be this Emancipation Day speaker. I had returned home for Christmas vacation from Tilton School in Tilton, New Hampshire, which is a prep school. My dad and my uncle thought it was important for the boys, my brother and me, to go away to prep schools in New England. And I went to Tilton School in Tilton, New Hampshire, and was there in Atlanta on vacation, on Christmas vacation. And the last, you may know that the last place a 13-year-old wants to be on New Year's Day is in a church, listening to speeches. But my dad insisted. He said that Virgil and David, you've got to go. And my dad used to growl when he talked. That King boy can make words march. That's the way he talked, march. That's what he was saying. That King boy can make words march. And so that was the first time that I heard Dr. King speak. And but the issue of race was something that we all had a very, very deep feeling about. We need to do something about this. And now, I always ask my students, do you know why that speech was called the Emancipation Day speech on January 1st, in this case it was 1958. And I might just ask you, I'll just teach the class and ask you, do you know why Dr. King's speech and why the speeches on that day, any speech on that day, would be called the Emancipation Day speech? Anybody?
Anniversary of 13th Amendment.
It's an anniversary. Emancipation Proclamation. That's the anniversary. January 1st, 1863. What president signed the Emancipation Proclamation? We know, Lincoln. That's an easy question. Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. Now, it's a tradition in the South and really here in the North, too, to have Emancipation Day programs. And it is customary to choose a person to bring the Emancipation Day address who's made a significant contribution to race relations during the previous year. And Dr. King, just off the very successful Montgomery bus boycott, was chosen to be the Emancipation Day speaker at Big Bethel A&E Church, selected by the Atlanta branch of the NAACP. Now, race was important to all of us. And so my assignment in this 1 hour that we have is to talk. I didn't select the topic, but I agreed to it. The history of the Civil Rights Movement. So we'll try to get a quick course in the history of the Civil Rights Movement. When did it start? And of course, that's a good place to begin. And there is at least discussion about what was the real beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. I'll talk about what I think is the beginning of it. I'd say 1954 was the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, but 1950.
So I don't know, I always thought, David, that I must take it back 100 years earlier.
100 years earlier?
Because I think the Dred Scott decision and the forces that gathered to oppose the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act really were the precursor to what has become the modern Civil Rights Act. That's sort of my perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a good perspective. And just as I say, that there are many other perspectives on when it started. And I chose to go with 1954 just because so many of the persons who decided to write books about it, I think this is really the most authoritative. If you want a quick course in the civil rights movement. This is the best. And I was talking to Alan upstairs a few minutes ago, and he was saying, wow, look at that thick book. And I said, well, you know, it's a trilogy. There are 3 of these that Taylor Branch has written, and they are just, each one is just as thick as this. This is, and I think this is the best of the 3. I've read all 3, but I think this is the best of the 3. So if you want a quick study in the civil rights movement and you really want to know the inside story, I've read several things that I personally knew, the events that I personally knew, and Taylor Branch gets it right every time. And he gives us the inside story of it. So I would recommend, if you're looking for just a quick book to give you an idea about the civil rights movement. And I'll go into in a minute why he chose it. And of course, some of you know why. Prize also chose 1954 as their beginning of it. But John?
In all of the cases leading up to Brown, and of course Brown's is 1954, but all of the higher education sweat against Painter, you know, those were all in the 40s leading up to Brown, and that certainly reflected the NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund, to enforce a new definition of rights on behalf of African Americans.
Yeah, that I think is one significant part of it.
I guess I would think of it really as the decision by Harry. Think about it. Here is somebody who came from Missouri, was not particularly enlightened based on some of the things we learned about him, but as Nixon used to say, pay more attention to what we do than what we say. Put aside Nixon for a moment. That decision by the president using the executive powers after World War II, having fought in World War I, so he understood what the sacrifice was that people made in wartime.
Yeah.
He didn't get it out of a book or in a movie.
That's
but
right.
I thought that decision, knowing how powerful the military was in the South, was, at least in my mind, the beginning of the decision now coming from the White House with all of the weight and authority saying that the military going forward is now no longer a segregated operation.
Yeah, that was a very, and that each of you are making a really great case for, and there are other cases to be made. Some people feel as though the murder of Emmett Till in Money, Mississippi, that outraged the nation. Jet magazine published the photograph of Emmett Till having been lynched, and his mother, Mamie Till Bradley, insisted on an open casket funeral because she wanted the world to see that how they had lynched her son, 14 years old, and was lynched presumably or allegedly because he whistled at a white woman, or because he had said bye baby to a white woman. Others say that Mrs. Parks keeping her seat in Montgomery was the beginning of the civil rights movement. The black soldiers returned from the war. They thought that they were going to be returning to a society in which they were full citizens, and thought that having fought in the war. And so Harry Truman, after the war, desegregated the armed forces, and that was a very significant event. And so we can make a case. That's what I began with, that you can make a case for when did it begin, and you can make a case for when it ended. You know, I think, and has it ended? That's a great question. We have a little dispute in these two sources about when the civil rights movement ended. And I would just ask you why these two authors may have chosen two dates. Taylor Branch chose America in the King years 1954 to 1963. He chose 1963. Why do you think he chose 1963? That was Okay, we already have people who participated. He was talking about America in the King years. He called it 1963. He wasn't saying necessarily that this was the end of the civil rights movement, but the authors of Eyes on the Prize, Henry Hampton, who did that very wonderful series that is the film series that we see on PBS all the time, and others did 1965. Now that's a little more difficult to say why. Why do you think 1965 might have been chosen by Henry Hampton and that series, Eyes on the Prize?
Civil rights legislation.
Yes, what
Like
legislation?
Johnson.
Voting Rights
The
Act.
Voting Rights Act.
Yeah.
Now, why might that have been the quote-unquote end of the civil rights movement?
Because that was when
How do you-
what people were starting to have equal opportunity and quality to vote and to move about.
Yeah, the idea, you see, that came on the heels of the Selma to Montgomery march. And the idea of that was that we can take the movement now, after Birmingham, after Albany, after the murders in Mississippi of Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, after Emmett Till, after all of these things, after the Montgomery bus boycott, when people took to the streets, we can now vote the rascals out. We can now say that we have full voting rights, and that these demonstrations, these street demonstrations, these kinds of things that were the hallmark of the sit-in demonstrations and the like, were not as necessary as they were at that time.
And then there was some other things happening on the governmental front in Washington, because you have JFK and you have his brother killed at that, in that time period. So now you have Lyndon B. Johnson coming in and actually putting through those laws, writing what he did not start. He did not start it. That was JFK.
Yeah.
But JFK never lived to write it out, so his vice president took over and put those laws that people fought and died for into
That's
motion.
right. Yeah, and that was a significant time too. 1968 was the assassination of Dr. King, and then the assassination in July of Robert Kennedy. King in April 4th, and Robert Kennedy in July, just a few months later. And I always look at the irony of the fact that 0 U.S. president, sitting U.S. president, attended Dr. King's funeral. No U.S. president. Bobby Kennedy was there, and he was a candidate for president, and he was welcomed as a very celebrated person, that the persons who were at the funeral welcomed him. But no U.S. president attended Dr. King's funeral. But when Mrs. King passed, I think it was 2005, there were 4 U.S. presidents that attended her funeral. So we can see how the things have changed since then. That Dr. King, who made so many contributions and sacrifices, became the icon that he did, and deservedly so. But it does give you an indication of what this movement meant to this society. This society has changed a great deal as a consequence of the kinds of activities that were brought about by the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
Judy?
I'm very interested to hear that LBJ didn't show up. I mean, he was embattled, obviously, at that point, but he and Dr. King had a real relationship.
Yeah.
Is there an
No,
explanation?
no.
And, yeah,
They
it
did-
was
they didn't have a
difficult.
good-
Well, I mean, the
They were
historians of LBJ would lead us to believe
Yeah.
that they had.
No, Judy, I could tell you, because Marsha's dad was very close to LBJ, and she overheard any number of conversations. So the King-LBJ relationship was a strained one.
Right.
It was not a close one.
But
But
they
you're right.
worked together, they certainly worked together.
Right, but most of at least as I understand it, most of the real implementation work was done with King in the room, but not as between King and Johnson.
That's very interesting.
Yeah,
That's very,
it's a very interesting thing.
Because if you read the Johnson folks, you almost would have anticipated that he would have been there.
Yeah. Well, Lyndon Johnson and of course John Rose and Marcia Cantarella, who is Whitney Young's daughter, had a very close working relationship. Whitney Young and LBJ were very close, or closer than King and LBJ. It was kind of a kind of a tension with LBJ and King. However, LBJ was certainly, undoubtedly, the most prolific of the civil rights presidents. He got more legislation in and did more for civil rights than any of the presidents that we have had, including JFK. JFK had the heart, but Lyndon Johnson got it done.
That's right.
And poverty too.
And poverty too. Yeah. So it's interesting that he didn't attend King's funeral. Why he didn't is a question. Yeah.
In connection with your statement about the end of the civil rights movement, I guess perhaps a much later date, if only on an emotional level, one could point to, which is the byproduct of the civil rights legislation, the Voting Rights Act, the election of Barack Obama, something that was unheard of back in the 60s. Or on a legal basis, what I personally think was after the Congress re-adopted the Voting Rights Act, the U.S. Supreme Court, in an opinion by Justice Roberts, held it just recently of legislation which enjoys a presumption of regularity now being set aside by the United States Supreme Court. So in my mind, the legal aspect was that decision, at least from my perspective. But the emotional end would have been if a black man could be elected president and re-elected president.
Yeah.
A manifestation of a movement having achieved its goals, at least many of its goals.
Yeah. Well, you can see, I hope that all of you can see that this is these are the kinds of things that we like to discuss in a course like the Anthropology of the Civil Rights Movement, because these are the kinds of things that are thought matters. And we need to do critical thinking. We need to make the case for whatever it is that we, I just kind of glossed over. I don't want to leave anybody without an understanding of why 1954 was an important date. This may be elementary to all of you, or many of you, but I don't want to leave it without saying that that was the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And it overturned the separate but equal decision, which is called Plessy versus Ferguson. But what I can add to that, which may not be common conventional knowledge, is that the mastermind of the 1954 Supreme Court decision, there was a mastermind of that decision. Does anybody know who I might have in mind about that?
Thurgood Marshall?
Well, Thurgood Marshall was his student.
Houston.
Charles Hamilton Houston. That's a name you may not have heard. And it's important that we know, because and the reason that I agree with Juan Williams and Caleb Branch on 1954 is because it was the genius of Charles Hamilton Houston that put the civil rights movement on put it in the federal courts and based it on the Constitution. So it's no longer just we treat people right because it's nice to do so. We treat people right because it's, we're good human beings and they should appeal to our character and our goodwill. we must do so because it is constitutional. And that is why two ministers, Wyatt T. Walker and Vernon John, stopped their car on Highway 67 in Virginia when it was announced May 17, 1954, that the Supreme Court of the United States had ruled that segregation was inherently, separation was inherently unequal, and overturned the Brown decision. The Warren Court overturned the Brown decision. That was an important decision, and it was a decision. I was in the 5th grade at the time, and we thought, it was announced about noon, because I remember that when we were out at recess, that and I was in a segregated public school, Catholic school in Atlanta, Georgia. And we thought that the next day we were going to be in the white school, and we passed the white school, and they had the baseball field, and so we would just think, oh well, we're going to be there the next day. But here many years later, the implementation of the Brown decision is still not achieved. So I didn't want to leave that as, but there were two kinds of segregation that we talk about when we talk about segregation. We talk about de jure segregation, segregation under law, and de facto segregation, segregation in practice, segregation that has to do with custom, and many of the kinds of things that we experience in the northern areas are part of de facto segregation. There are neighborhoods right here in New York City that are de facto segregated. There are institutions that are de facto segregated institutions. And so that whole issue of race was what this civil rights movement was all about. And all of the events of the civil rights movement are events that had to do with the courage that it took, not just on the parts of blacks, but on the parts of all of those conscientious American citizens who were willing to put life and limb on the line in nonviolent protest in order to achieve the accomplishments of the civil rights movement. Exactly one year before his assassination in Memphis, Dr. King gave a speech at the Riverside Church here in New York. And I always feel as though the quotation that I like the most from Dr. King is the quotation that he gave at that time. One of the reasons that he and Lyndon Johnson didn't have a famous relationship, a really very good relationship, was that he opposed him on the Vietnam War. And Johnson didn't take too kindly to that because he felt as though, wow, you're opposing me on Vietnam, and I have done so much to show you. Johnson even ended one of his speeches, and we shall overcome. And all the leadership of the civil rights movement was just floored when they heard him end a State of the Union speech with the phrase, "We shall overcome." That was the theme song of the civil rights movement, "We shall overcome," and written by Pete Seeger, wrote that song, who recently died. But King did oppose President Johnson on the Vietnam War, and he did it. He was the first public figure to come out against the Vietnam War at the Riverside Church, April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before he was assassinated in Memphis. And the quotation that I like is, I like it because it just showed the character of Martin Luther King. He said, and it came out of frustration too, because many of the other civil rights leaders were critical of Dr. King because he was branching out and criticizing Johnson against the war when Johnson had been such a friend to the movement. And so Dr. King came up with this, and I just think it's just a wonderful reflection of his character. He said that vanity asks the question, is it popular? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Cowardice asks the question, is it safe? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And sometimes we're called upon to do things that are neither popular, nor politic, nor safe, but we must do them because they are right. I like that quotation from Dr. King because I think it just really expresses his character. It does express his frustration too with his friends who were critical of him for being against the Vietnam War, but it also expressed his character, and that was the character that was so characteristic of the people who were involved in the civil rights movement. This idea of standing on instance of and putting their life and limb on the line with the sit-in demonstrations. You've seen some of the film, and the Freedom Riders taking out their last wills and testaments. It was possible that they would not return alive, but having been so invested in their lives on the line like that, and then the other events of the civil rights movement, from Montgomery, when Rosa Parks was to Memphis, where Dr. King was assassinated with the striking garbage workers. But there are so many, one of my purposes, if we hadn't had such a great discussion, was to introduce you to, and I think I still will do it, because I can only show just a portion of it, but to introduce you to someone that is very, is not well known, whose contributions to the civil rights movement were foundational, groundbreaking. In fact, he was introduced to us in this book by Taylor Branch, and his name is Vernon Johns. And even though Taylor Branch introduced Vernon Johns, I heard about Vernon Johns at the breakfast table at our home for many years. My dad would talk about Vernon. He talked about two people a lot. He talked about Vernon Johns in Montgomery, Alabama, and he talked about Charlie Houston in New York, who was the general counsel for the NAACP. But Vernon Johns was legendary in black households prior to Martin Luther King. He was the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, before Martin Luther King came on as the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Connie Chung had a program years ago that was called Saturday Night with Connie Chung. And as her very first program, she decided to make the program about Vernon Johns. And I'm going to show about 5 minutes of that program because I think it will, in that 5 minutes, it'll tell you a little something about Vernon Johns. But I'd like for you to let that 5 minutes, and I'll play 5 minutes of it, and then I'd like to maybe take the other 3 minutes to talk about what you've seen and to talk about a little bit more about Vernon Johns. So we'll play that.
September 23rd. God's Bad Boy, Montgomery, Alabama.
There is no justifiable homicide. God never spoke about justifiable homicide. He said, thou shalt not kill. He didn't say, thou shalt not kill unless you got an excuse. Thou shalt not kill unless you're white.
Isn't it amazing, the power of a few words? Good evening, I'm Connie Chung. The words you just heard are from a man named Vernon Johns. He spent his whole life turning those words into weapons. Vernon Johns died 24 years ago. Probably never heard of him, but after tonight, I don't think you'll ever forget him. We interviewed people who knew him best. You'll see them in a minute. You'll also see the Vernon Johns they remember, and we asked James Earl Jones to portray him. Let me tell you a couple more things about Vernon Johns. He was a farm boy who mastered German, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, and then talked his way into a white college. He was a poet, a prophet, and a preacher. And if you aren't familiar with his name or his words, you're certainly familiar with what they created, because Vernon Johns, who never stopped thinking of himself as a farmer, sowed the seeds for the biggest social movement of our time.
Well, first I have to tell you, I see him as a father. I mean, that's my relationship. I'm his child. He called me Baby D, which was his way of saying baby dearest. I was never frightened when I was with my father. I was frightened for my father. Well, I used to be afraid all the time that he was going to get killed or get hit or beat or whatever, because he was always doing things which were so out of the prescribed behavior for blacks. I thought white people might beat him or kill him. Those are things that I really haven't ever talked about. But I used to wonder whether or not.
Now, I know we don't like to see that. And if we had time, we would. The persons who make comments about Vernon Johns are the author of the book Pale Branch, but Andrew Young is one of the persons, Wyatt T. Walker is another one of the persons, Gardner Taylor is another one of the persons who comment about their own personal experiences with Dr. Johns. And the college that they're talking about was Oberlin College in Ohio, and the person who was competition for Johns as the scholar on the campus was the former president of the University of Chicago, Robert Hutchins. Robert Maynard Hutchins. Thank you, Judy. And they were classmates, and the story of their, you see, Vernon Johns was really a farm boy, but he spoke many languages and had almost a photographic memory. But he challenged the system of segregation there in Montgomery and did it in a defiant way. He would go into a lunch counter and demand to be served at that time. This was before Rosa Parks kept her seat. And that's what Tony Johns was indicating, that she was just always afraid for her father, because he was legendary among us because we just never knew anybody like Vernon Johns who would defy the system of segregation in that way. Well, I invite you to read about him. I think he's someone that is an unsung hero of the civil rights movement. And are there questions?
Have you heard of a man by the name of Shuttlesworth?
Oh, yes. Fred Shuttlesworth in Birmingham, Alabama. He was the pastor of the 16th Street Baptist Church, the church where the 4 little girls were killed in the bombing incident. Incidentally, the bombing incident occurred in 1963. just after the March on Washington. After this enormous euphoria that came from this 250,000 people marching on the Mall in Washington, D.C. A great movement of nuns and priests, and rabbis and preachers and common folk from all over the country had descended on Washington, D.C., and it just gave such momentum to the civil rights movement and to the movement that we're in this together. And that is really the essence. I really want to close with what Dr. King said about that. It really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated, interconnected, and interdependent. We are all caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. That is the interrelated structure of reality. And we were in this all together. This was an interracial movement. It was a movement about segregation. It was a movement about injustice, especially to blacks. But it was an interracial movement, and we owe television, we owe the media, and newspapers and magazines and the like for getting the word out. But when the word got out, the outrage of the country came to bear, and this was a large part of the success of the civil rights movement. Other questions? I think that's about all the time we have.
Well, let's thank Professor Hodges very much.
Thank you.
Now or?
And also, of course, Professor Hodges teaches this class,
Yes.
but also he's going to organize a program. We're working on a program to bring, you talk about it, to go across the South. Go ahead.
That's right. We're going to have in the winter semester, the January term here at Hunter, tracing the steps of the civil rights movement. We're going to take students, I will conduct the class, and we're going to take students, we're going to fly from here to New Orleans, and then we're going to take a bus from New Orleans through Mississippi, through the places in Mississippi where there were events, in Alabama, Birmingham, Montgomery, Atlanta, where I was born and grew up, and we'll have the various leaders that are still alive of the civil rights movement to come and talk with the students. And then we're going to wind up in Memphis and then fly back from Memphis to New York. The travel part of the trip will be about 3 weeks, wow. And there will be about 3 days on each side of lectures before we go. So it's going to be a very exciting kind of trip, and so that's.
And the students will have scholarships. We're still working on that, but it's not going to be something that's only for students with money. It's going to be a scholarship program.
That's absolutely terrific, David. I mean, that really fulfills the dream that we have of moving from what people think of as a typical public university where people come to providing the kinds of experiences that you get at the private colleges and the more elite universities. So it really is putting Hunter sort of on the map.
Yeah.
You won't get that in a private college. You will only get that from Professor Hodges in a public university. I may have other things.
Right.
Maybe Skip Gates or something like that.
Yeah, true enough.
But the idea is that we will be going and hands-on, and that they will get to what it's urgent anthropology, because increasingly the people that they can meet and talk with and that I can introduce them to are rapidly vanishing. My own brother passed away on March 13th, and he was the state of New York executive director of the state of New York Martin Luther King Commission, which was chaired by Harry Belafonte. And he just knew, and of course through him I know quite a few of the persons who were very involved in the civil rights movement, especially in Atlanta, Georgia. So we really look forward to this course.
Very exciting.
Yes.
There's interracial marriages in the South, but what is the condition of them at that point? Is there danger in that's still a factor?
It's rare that it would be unheard of even Atlanta, and Atlanta is not really the worst of the, what we talk about when we talk about segregation in the buses in Montgomery. It was an awful kind of segregation. They had to get on the bus, deposit their money, get off the bus, go to the back, and then get back on the bus.
With interracial marriages in Mississippi, of all places.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying. So there were different kinds of, but even in Atlanta, where there wasn't that kind of getting off the bus, and you could go through the bus to the back of the bus. But even there, and Mayor Hartsfield Jackson is the name of the airport now. Maynard Jackson was the black mayor. William B. Hartsfield was the white mayor. And so Hartsfield is the one who declared that Atlanta was a city too busy to hate. And he was a very progressive mayor, and we loved Mayor Hartsfield. He was the one who desegregated the police force in Atlanta. And he did a lot of things that were, interracial. You just didn't see an interracial couple that
Right, it was also
down
against the law in
Well,
Virginia,
yeah.
Mississippi. I mean, 1967
No, they
is
just lived, they
Lubbock.
just would sleep with an
Oh, well,
African-American
yes.
woman.
Oh yeah, you'll see it often now.
Yeah.
Yeah, in Mississippi even. It would be taking a chance in Mississippi.
Yeah,
as
so
far
this
as
is-
I'm
right.
concerned,
I was gonna say, but you have to be in a certain pocket, right? Maybe
Yeah,
Jackson,
yeah.
you get away with it, but.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Open your presents.
Oh.
Everybody's dying.